Hello and welcome. I'm Bob Cusack, Editor-in-Chief of The Hill. Thank you for joining us for our Cybersecurity Summit. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and in today's program, we'll explore the state of our nation's critical infrastructure, cyber defenses, data privacy, and consumer and business safety. But before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, Looking Glass Cyber Solutions, for supporting today's event. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll discuss how we can defend our infrastructure from present and future threats. We will ask how Congress, the administration, and the private sector can work together to bolster our cyber defenses while protecting consumer privacy. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, and joining me to lead these conversations is my colleague Maggie Miller, The Hill's cybersecurity reporter. Welcome, Maggie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillCybersecurity. We are broadcasting live, and we will be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience some occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. Joining us to kick off the program is Congresswoman Yvette Clarke from New York, chair of the Homeland Cybersecurity Infrastructure Protection and Innovation Subcommittee. Maggie had the chance to speak with her a short while ago.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And during such a busy month of the year, the busiest month of the year in cybersecurity. And I wanted to kick off our conversation today by kind of asking a top-down question about where we are after what can only be described as an incredibly tumultuous year in cybersecurity, a difficult year, to say the least. You know, if you had to pick out, a threat that we've seen over the last year that still continues to be an issue for this country, what's the biggest threat that you think, we as a nation face? And, how are we positioned to approach that threat?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for having me, Maggie. It's a pleasure to be with you during this Cybersecurity Awareness and Education Month. And if there's something I think that is foremost in my mind and that of the American people, it's the level of ransomware attacks that we have witnessed. And, we hear about the big corporations that get hit sometimes way after the fact. But the fact of the matter is that there are ransomware attacks happening each and every day, not only in the private sector, but in our government sector, whether it's state and local governments. And, that is an indication of the fact that our adversaries are never sleeping, and that we've got to do everything we can to improve our cybersecurity posture. We've been able to avoid certainly sort of the worst possible outcomes, the things that keep us up at night. But at the end of the day, it's extremely costly. We are finding after the fact that many have succumbed to the ransom demands of bad actors, and it's very, very costly. So what are we doing? One of the things that we have done through the committee on the subcommittee on cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, and innovation in the Department of Homeland Security Committee is to put forth legislation to assist our state, local, and tribal governments in really standing up a much more robust cybersecurity posture through a piece of legislation that is in our budget reconciliation bill that we hope will pass, because there's, I think, nothing more important for us right now than there are a lot of important things, but the specter of cyber threats that are constantly at our infrastructure as individuals, as entities, as the private sector, and as a government is almost insurmountable. So we've got to be far more outgoing in terms of the work that we do to educate, inform, and provide the tools that are needed to deter, to mitigate damages, and to learn from the ways in which our adversaries are behaving so that we can prevent as many intrusions as we possibly can.
And I wanted to ask you about the bill that you mentioned there that I know you're spearheading, and specifically zoom in on one of the big areas of debate that there's been on Capitol Hill in recent weeks, which is around timeframes for mandatory cyber incident reporting to the federal government. I know that there's a bill in the Senate that calls for 24 hours. I know that there are bills that call for 72 hours. Can you speak to what you're hearing from industry in terms of these timeframes around incident reporting, and also why this timeframe is so vital specifically for CISA in terms of combating some of these threats?
Well, as you rightly stated, there's a divergence of thought about what is the best way to encourage the private sector in particular to do their reporting. And what your audience should know is that so much of our critical infrastructure is within the private sector, that it's important that we bring all stakeholders to the table to really get at the heart of what makes the most sense. And in our conversations with various stakeholders, we believe that given the types of attacks that we have seen on our critical infrastructure that we've experienced in the private sector, it's important that, one, they immediately address these intrusions, and that they're given enough time to sort of wrap their arms around it and then report to us what is taking place. And it's really about building trust. For the private sector, they're not used to a whole lot of government partnership, with the exception of sort of the regulatory regimes that they find themselves under. We recognize that in cyberspace, it is critical that we build that trust and that we create a space where people, entities feel safe in reporting to us what is taking place, so that CISA, when I say we, I mean CISA, has the ability to go in, to work with them, to get a sense of situational awareness, and also some forensic ability to get a sense of what it is our adversaries are really up to, where these intrusions are coming from. Not only are we talking about the fact that we are dealing with sometimes domestic, cyber threats, but they also can be international in nature. And I think, the public is well aware that our adversaries spend every waking moment, particularly coming out of Russia, China, North Korea, sometimes Iran, that we must be very diligent. And the only way that we enhance that diligence is by partnering with the private sector, where so many of these intrusions, can mean catastrophic occurrences in the lives of the American people.
Yeah, absolutely. And to piggyback off of that a little bit, there's a bill in the Senate Homeland Security Committee, which was just approved, that would also give a timeline for reporting if a company pays ransomware payments. What are your thoughts on, having legislation in place that would, beyond a time frame for mandatory reporting, also require companies to report if they pay up so that they can access their networks?
Yeah, I think that, our inclinations are to create a space where we're not paying ransoms. The more it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you feed into these bad actors, the more it becomes lucrative for them to continue their behavior. It is important that we know when a company has paid ransom. As you stated, we don't want to miss that window of opportunity. If that was the route they took, to be able to understand the magnitude of what occurred to them. And so it's critical that, we create a safe space, again, to report when a company has paid a ransom in order to, receive their data back, access to their data, whatever the circumstances may call for, because oftentimes we think about what happens in an incident when we're dealing with information theft. We're now ratcheting up our our perspective to include critical infrastructure. I think that we came very close with the Colonial Pipeline in terms of understanding how the information technological end of their company interfaces and interlaces with their industrial control systems. As a matter of fact, out of an abundance of caution, they shut down the pipeline, right? But we saw what the implications for that are in real time. And so, as you stated, they had already paid a ransom by the time this was widely reported, and sort of there was this fallout as a result of that. We want to try to get in there and encourage through partnerships the ability to sort of piggyback off of whether it's a third party entity that is helping the companies to navigate these cyber attacks and threats, so that we have a sense of what our adversaries are doing and what the implications are for the American people.
And some of these groups that have been hardest hit by ransomware attacks have been state and local governments, which I know is an area you are also passionate about funneling resources towards, such as through your State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act. Can you talk to what the status of this bill is in terms of moving forward, potential inclusion in packages moving forward, and also, what you think more, even beyond the bill, can be done to help these, very vulnerable and underfunded, often, state and local governments?
Well, it's a $500 million grant program in my legislation that would enable our state, local, and tribal governments to gain access to the types of sort of infrastructure protection that they require in order to really mitigate damages or prevent them from the outset, to build out a workforce dedicated to monitoring their networks and working in partnership with CISA to identify threats. Right now, the bill has been incorporated into the Build Back Better Act. And unfortunately, there's some give and take here with respect to the amount of funding that may be made available. But we really believe we've got to start somewhere. So many of our local entities, our government agencies have already been hit. I mean, we've all witnessed right there in DC, the Washington, DC Police Department, being infiltrated, being threatened, and having vital information released. That is very dangerous in terms of public safety. And you can see how that would even take on a whole nother level of danger, if you will, as we move throughout national security. So we want to start on the ground floor with our state, local, municipal governments, giving them the incentive. And with our bill, we are also incentivizing states to partner with us and take this on as an area of expertise within their own governments so that they can be on the front lines with us. And we would partner with funding these initiatives in our states, our municipalities, our tribal governments, so that it will be enduring, which is important because we're in this for the long haul. After, I think, what we've experienced with COVID-19, the rapid adoption of the virtual world as we know it, it's important that we see this as a real discipline and that we encourage at every level of governance in the private sector and, quite frankly, among individuals, a conscientious hygiene for all things cyber. At the end of the day, we all become a weakest link for our adversaries to infiltrate our networks. And that can mean, catastrophic danger to life as we know it.
Absolutely. And, as I mentioned, it has been an incredibly difficult year in cybersecurity, but it's also shed a lot of attention, a lot of the spotlight on this issue. Can you speak to how some of these major incidents, such as the attack on, Colonial Pipeline, JBS, the SolarWinds hack, has helped fuel interest and bipartisanship in cybersecurity, and also how this might fuel your work in the subcommittee?
Well, let me say that we have seen a real sea change in sort of the interest and the actions to protect ourselves. The last administration had somewhat of a disjointed approach to cybersecurity. And so we're really making up for lost time. And I think that the Biden administration has really demonstrated how very critical this is to, again, I hate to be hyperbolic, but life as we know it. And they've begun to put the appropriate personnel in place. We now have a director in the White House specific to cybersecurity. We're beefing up the ability for CISA to expand its bandwidth to help us and to be able to gather the tools, expertise, and ability to work with the private sector, to work with the federal enterprise, to harden our ability to protect ourselves against these cyber attacks. So I think that there's been a shift, a very important and necessary shift to being extremely conscientious and serious about building out a practice, if you will, of cybersecurity within the federal enterprise, which will help us both at the state, the local, the tribal level to really be on the front guard, on the front lines and guarding against malicious actors.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Congresswoman, for your time with us today, and also your work in cybersecurity. Wish you the best of luck, and the best of luck getting through the rest of this incredibly busy month.
Well, thank you for having me, Maggie, and to everyone out there. Cyber hygiene is so very important. If you are online, you should be looking to employ two-factor authentication so that we know it's you when you're using, the various hard software on the net. You can Google it. You can find out much more about how to protect yourself, or you can reach out to CISA and they will be a resource to you. This is cybersecurity education and cyber awareness month. We all need to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem.
Absolutely. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie, and Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. Very nice interview. Our next guest is Mike Rogers. He's a former member of Congress from Michigan. He is also a former Army officer and FBI special agent. While in Congress, he chaired the Intelligence Committee and became a leader on cyber and national security policy. He is now the incoming chairman of the not-for-profit Mitter Corporation and director of IronNet Cybersecurity. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, okay, in 2018, you said America is in a cyber war, and I'm not convinced we're winning. It's 3 years later. Are we winning?
No, unfortunately not. We're the big behemoth we know as the federal government is just a slow-moving enterprise. And that slow-moving enterprise is having a hard time configuring itself right to actually target the cyber problem in an effective way across the whole of government, number one. And number two, our adversaries have not been waiting for us to catch up. They're continuing to improve their tradecraft in cyber war. They've been a lot more aggressive. We've seen a lot more from the Chinese, even attacking certain aspects of our military and trying to do new techniques that would make it very difficult for us to be successful in an armed conflict. So they're putting the gas on. We are starting to get interested, and I think that's the difference, unfortunately.
In an interview with 60 Minutes, the Fed chief, Jay Powell, said what keeps him up at night is cyber. What do you think are the preeminent threats, either sectors, countries? What keeps you up at night?
Well, and my partner in Congress at the time, Dutch Rufusberger, we used to say cyber was keeping us up at night back as early as 2006. And guess what? It hasn't changed. It's only gotten worse. So it still keeps me up. And it's because, moving the pieces in the federal government is not really addressing the threat. And we've got to be really careful about knowing the difference. And I'm really happy that Congresswomen like Yvette Clarke are kind of on it, and they're paying attention to it. This is helpful. It'll get resources, it'll get attention, it'll get answers. It'll help get the behemoth federal government trying to find ways to keep ahead of this. But sometimes our ability to tell the private sector what to do and what the government is helping them do are two different things. And we're going to have to answer that question. Do you want your federal government to help protect private networks in a way that we know they have capabilities to do? Today, the answer is no. And that has consequences. So all of that keeps me up. If you think about ransomware, it's getting better. It's getting more sophisticated. It's been around a while, but we're watching it improve. So think about it in 2019, $11 billion cost to the economy, $11 billion. By 2021, it was $20 billion. The average payment's about $233,000, about 19 days on average, a company gets taken offline. And the remediation cost is somewhere around $1.8 million. So you start adding that across the economy, that is a huge, huge factor. And so what worries me, what keeps me up at night, is that our adversaries are starting to understand you don't have to attack the National Security Agency or the CIA or even the Pentagon, even though they do. We just have to make sure that we're disruptive in their economy. So if we ever wanted to throw the switch, we can turn the lights out, we can cause businesses to absolutely shut down. That part worries me. You have to look at this the way our adversaries are looking at it, not the way we want to treat it. And they're looking at it as this is part of their national security strategy. They want to prep the battlefield if they ever have to engage the United States anywhere in the world. How do you do that? You cause us a lot of problems in cyberspace with private sector companies, with certain military aspects and movements. All of that is in their planning and in their toolbox. And again, what keeps me up at night is I don't believe we're ready to push back on that at every level that they're pushing on us. That's something to be concerned about.
I want to pass it over to my colleague, Maggie, who knows a lot about cyber and is a great reporter for us. Maggie, you have a question for the Congressman.
Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman. And, you know, I wanted to ask you, yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you about the country that's been on everyone's lips in cybersecurity this year, which is Russia. I know that the Biden administration has taken a series of actions in order to counter some of this Russian cyber aggression, you know, including President Biden meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But do you think that the Biden administration has gone far enough in terms of responding to some of these attacks that are either, you know, from the Russian government or at least from cyber criminals that are being harbored by Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Biden administration has had a forward-leaning cyber effort toward our adversaries, Russia. But the biggest answer to that, I think, is self-evident if we've gone far enough as a country, is name the consequences for Russia engaged in the behavior that they've had. Yeah, you'll get that chirping cricket in the back corner of the room because there is really been no effective consequence for their actions. And so think about it. Their Navy is pretty much fallen apart. They have some pretty good quality submarines. And so if they're going to project power around the world, they're doing it through their special forces, number one, and they're doing it through cyber and their other espionage and information operations, which is all part of their cyber operations. And they've been massively impactful. And so I argue until we can start bleeding their nose a little bit and showing consequences to their cyber activities, and I'm not talking about armed engagement, I am talking about making it more difficult. And when they do something that kind of gets under, that has an impact in the United States, think about information operations against the 2016 election or solar winds. That was, candidly, it wasn't a disruption operation. It was an absolute brilliant espionage operation. And so they weren't trying to disrupt things. They were trying to steal things. So that is something that both governments do. But disruption, where they try to get into our electric grid, maybe to turn some things off, that's the kind of time, or information operations where they're trying to sow chaos in the United States. We must be more aggressive against all of our adversaries to let them know we're not going to tolerate.
Congressman, as far as cooperation, you've served in Congress, the Intelligence Committee chair at the FBI, now at MITRE. What frustrates you? What do you think we could be doing a lot better, whether that's federal-state coordination, maybe it's working with our allies against countries like China, North Korea, and Russia? What is something that you tell your former colleagues in Congress, this is what we got to do?
Yeah, having meetings doesn't solve a problem. It's a method. It's a tool to get to a problem. And so we have the same problem that we looked at back when I became chairman in 2010 about ability to share information in real time. And this is, again, a question, it was so distorted. If you remember the whole Snowden incident, he made it sound like the NSA was, reading every email and doing things that simply were not true. But the narrative got ahead of the reality and the facts. And it really slowed down U.S. efforts to have this real-time sharing of threat information. So what I mean by that is sometimes the government knows what certain threat vectors are. They know what that code looks like or variants of that code looks like. And what if we could share in real time? If company A in California could put it into share in real time, machine to machine, meaning no human looks at it and says, I'm getting hit with this thing. The government looks at that and says, we're going to spread that around across the country so nobody else gets hit by that thing. And that was the goal back then. We're still not there yet. And part of it is, if you're a company, and this is where I keep pleading with my former colleagues, you have to understand companies don't want to share information with our Department of Homeland Security. They don't want to share information with the U.S. government, period. They might do it with the NSA because they know they believe that they have the ability to lock it down. But they're very concerned about that. They have shareholders. They have all the other kinds of things. One committee in Congress is saying we should punish them for getting hit with ransomware. One committee is saying, no, we should help them. If it's very confusing if you're a business out there who isn't in the business of cybersecurity, right? You're producing cars, let's say. And so you want to be able to build the best cars in the world at the best price in the world. You're not really thinking about how complicated it is to share threat information that might shut down my car company or stop me from getting parts to build a car. Well, they think about all those things. And so until we get this right, until we decide in America, do you want your federal government to help protect companies who are being attacked by the Chinese, the Russians, the North Koreans, and the Iranians, and now others at a very high level? Do we think that the federal government should help protect our networks from that? Right now, again, as I said, the answer is still no. And so how do we get this done? We can do this and protect privacy. This notion that you either have to have privacy or security is wrong. You can have both. And I argue you can't have privacy until you have security. And so we just haven't gotten there yet. We've got to work this out. We have to quit talking about it. We have to quit admiring the problem. We have to, exalting the problem. We now need to really sit down and say, okay, we're going to have to find a way forward. Our adversaries are attacking the United States every single day. They're attacking our private sector. Mm-hmm. They're attacking our deployed military and our intelligence officers around the world. We really need to decide if we're going to stand up and unify our effort here to do it. That idea of a collective defense, and there are some private companies doing it. IronNet is one, about how we collect data and share the threat information in a way that's meaningful. The federal government needs to get in on that.
Congressman, we run out of time, but thank you so much. You're definitely, your stuff on this, and you can put it in a way that people understand. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And now for a message from our sponsor, Looking Glass Cyber Solutions. Please welcome Mary Yang, Chief Marketing Officer of Looking Glass Cyber Solutions, in conversations with Dr. John Zangardi, an advisory board member at Looking Glass and president of Red Horse Corporation. Mary, over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm super excited today to be sitting down with Dr. John Zangardi to hear some of his thoughts on cybersecurity and that intersection of the federal government and critical infrastructure. Just to start, Dr. Zangardi, with your expertise in technology and digital transformation and your background across both the public and private sectors, what do you see as the main reason that so many organizations continue to struggle with getting cybersecurity right?
Well, hey, Mary, first off, thanks for having me here today. It's a privilege to be able to speak to everyone and share some of my thoughts. So there is an increasing complexity of networks. Some of it is stemming from the work from home or WFM, the proliferation of mobile devices, the proliferation of IoT, the movement to the cloud, the number of applications out there. So you have this very complicated environment that's increasingly becoming more and more complicated as more becomes available to be put on the network. So as you're sitting back and you're wondering, how do I deal with this complexity and not being overwhelmed by it and the number of alerts that are coming in? There's a role here for increased visibility into the attack surface and understanding the endpoints and the risk associated with those endpoints. Things like, hey, who has access beyond what is necessary for them to do their job? Who is at home working from home, but is really at Starbucks on a network that you have no idea where it is and how vulnerable it is? Those kinds of things are so important and so hard for a CIO and CISO to get their arms around. But really when it comes down to it, staff is big, and sometimes staff is pushed to the limits in terms of their time. And there's the vulnerability of emails, phishing attempts, and making sure that your staff is trained and alert to deal with that. All it takes is one wrong click and you're going to have a bad day on your network. The other piece is cyber hygiene, the lack thereof, the complexity of your network, knowing what's out there, having that total asset visibility. So in summation, what I would say is complexity, the proliferation of so many devices, work from home and all that, has really led to a problem with understanding your assets, the visibility, and your risk posture out to the endpoints to include all of your attack surface. So it's a pretty tough environment for folks to get their arms around. And what CIOs and CISOs need are the tools in the cyber environment that are simple and easy to use, that don't provide false positives, and help use, through the use of machine learning and artificial intelligence, cut down on the time-consuming tasks, such as a lot of alerts that will overwhelm your SOC team. Things like that could really help in the future to reduce the problems associated with today's network environment.
Do you think there's one simple change that federal government or critical infrastructure organizations could make to improve that visibility of the attack surface?
Yeah, there's plenty of tools out there right now that provide endpoint visibility that will tell you if your endpoints have been patched, if your endpoints are connected to the network. There are plenty of tools that are out there. One of the things that they should be looking at are tools that provide resiliency. So on one piece, you have tools. The other piece, you have what you can do. I grew up a naval aviator, and one of the things that you do in aviation is you practice for that bad day. You know your emergency procedures, because when the engine's on fire, you don't have time to page through the book and look up step one, step two. You've got to know what to do. And that's something similar that needs to be done in running a network in cyber. So when a breach happens, you should be able to have practiced your responsive. How do you go about determining what happened? How do you go about responding to it? And how do you go about recovering? Each one of those requires a plan that's been exercised and put into play. So it's a mix of things. It's the tools, it's the people and how they're trained, that they have a plan that's executable. But I'm going to take it one step further. One of the things I noticed from all my time in government and industry is, and this is making fun of my particular profession, we talk in acronyms, and a lot of folks have no idea what we just said. And if you're a very senior person, whether you're on a board of directors or you're a secretary or deputy secretary of a department, you might be intimidated to ask deeper questions because you wouldn't even understand the answer. It's incumbent upon the CIOs and CISOs to explain what they're doing in English and explain the risk. For example, if this network goes down, you'll no longer be able to process customs. So that means anything coming into the United States at this port of entry will back up. So something that they understand in those terms, the probability and the consequence, just like the old, risk posture cues.
Thanks so much, John. I appreciate that. So to close out this conversation, what do you think is one takeaway that you think the viewers watching this could act on this week to improve their cybersecurity?
Oh, it's really simple. Cyber hygiene, multi-factor authentication, patching, making sure that you've got configuration and compliance across your network. That's just basic. That's 101. But you really need to go further than that. You need to understand your attack surface. You need to understand what tools are on your system. How old are your laptops? How old are these things? Are they capable of handling modern software? And that's where you need to be moving. You should be moving towards constantly refreshing things to make sure that they're new and up to date with the latest standards. You would be surprised if you start looking at many networks that even though we think we're fully patched, you're probably not fully patched, because sometimes endpoints are disconnected or the connectivity to the network is off. So understanding what's out there and having that visibility over your assets, asset management, configuration management is key. And the last thing I'll say is, when you're looking at tools and when you're looking at procedures, you need to make sure you're building in resilience. And that resilience needs to promote visibility. It needs to promote remote patching. It needs to promote enforcement of compliance. And it needs to promote configuration and compliance control across your entire network.
Yeah, I think that's one of those reasons why patching continues to be hard across really every organization from a cyber perspective.
It is. And you know, one of the things I've learned in life is if you focus sunlight on something, it usually gets fixed. So all you got to do is make a very simple spreadsheet to keep track of all the patches that are coming out. And when they're done, and boy, if people see they're falling behind, they usually heave ho and get on with it. At least that's been my experience.
That's great. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Z. We really appreciate all of your thoughts, your expertise. Love chatting with you.
Thank you, Mary. Have a great day.
You too.
Our next guest, Janet Napolitano, was the third Secretary of Homeland Security and is now the director of the University of California, Berkeley Center for Security and Politics. Madam Secretary, thanks for joining us so much.
Oh, thank you.
I asked this to former Congressman Mike Rogers. What is something that you think that the public needs to know about cyber that maybe it's not, doesn't know now, and big picture, what are the solutions the policymakers need to tackle?
Well, I think the public needs to know and appreciate the benefits and the risks that go along with living in a cyber era, and how it can affect their daily activities. If a municipality is the victim of a ransomware attack and all of a sudden all of its emergency services capabilities go down, its 9/11 system gets locked out, that affects ordinary citizens. If the grid is hacked and goes down, that affects ordinary citizens. So understanding and appreciating the benefits of living with this new technology that we have. It's not new anymore, but it's constantly evolving. But also the risks to our everyday life. That's something that the public needs to kind of get embedded.
One of the more vexing issues facing policymakers is this whole issue of ransomware payments. Some say, well, listen, we can't keep paying ransom, basically, otherwise we're incentivizing. On the other hand, these corporations, and I'm sure every corporate board now has been tackling, they've got to have a plan in place because maybe years ago they were asleep, but now in the wake of solar winds and other attacks, they've got to kind of wake up on this. But where would you stand on paying the people who are attacking you?
Well, it would be easy to say never pay ransom, but there are real demerits with that kind of an approach. And if you're attacked and the amount of ransom is, $1 million or $2 million, and in the meantime, your systems are totally down and you're locked out, or you can't get access to your data or any of that kind of information, you're going to weigh it. It's going to be very situational. However, where I think the government needs to step in is on attribution. Attribution of who is the party demanding ransom, whether they are a state-sponsored actor, a state actor, or simply a state-supported actor, and then be prepared at the government level to make an appropriate response.
As far as government power, just want to follow up on that. I was talking to a government official, and he was expressing frustration that you can get warrants to go into somebody's house, break down the door if they don't answer it. But the warrants, as far as going after phone information, going after, unlocking what's in their phone if it's a potential bad guy, it's a lot more difficult, especially when tech companies have said, well, listen, we don't want to give everything over to the government. What's the answer there? Because then there's an incentive for cyber attackers to just say, I'm not going to give the phone over, and tech companies also protecting their customers.
Right. So that was the situation between the FBI and Apple a few years ago, where the FBI wanted data from a phone that had been in the possession of a shooter in San Bernardino, California, and the shooters were had some contact with terrorist organizations, and the FBI wanted that data from their phone. And Apple's response was, well, if we give it to you, then our customers will know that our promise of encryption doesn't really hold. Now, in the end, another country was able to break into the phone, and the problem got resolved. That's a really difficult question. How do you measure or balance the customer's requirement for privacy, et cetera, versus the government's legitimate need for intelligence and information? In my view, there ought to be a sort of an elevated warrant requirement. In other words, that the government needs to be able to demonstrate not only the need for the information, but that they have no other way of getting it, and that not getting it poses itself a danger to the public.
Do you think there needs to be a lot more cooperation, whether it's the private sector and the federal government, or the federal government and states, to make sure that we are winning the cyber war, which former Congressman Mike Rogers just said we're not winning?
Right. Well, I think one of the key areas that we need to improve on is the sharing of real-time information between private industry that controls 85 to 90% of the nation's critical infrastructure with the government, so that there is a way of knowing on a real-time basis if there's been a breach, a hack, an attack, et cetera, and an immediate determination made as to whether that information needs to be shared, and immediate work begun on attribution for the source of the attack. Right now, reporting by private industry is done, episodically and voluntarily. And I'm not sure that gives us the kind of coverage that we need.
I want to toss it over to my colleague, Maggie Miller, who is our cyber expert and a great reporter. Maggie, you have a question.
Hi, Madam Secretary. Thank you again so much for joining us.
You bet.
I wanted to ask you about your position. You also sit on Zoom's board of directors, and I know that Zoom had one of the more difficult transitions into the current COVID-19 landscape in terms of so many moving online so quickly to use Zoom. Can you speak to some of the security improvements made, lessons learned, and also lessons learned about trying to move this type of infrastructure towards a much larger audience in a faster time frame?
Well, I do sit now on the Zoom board, and you're right. In early spring of 2020, when everybody went into lockdown and schools went into remote learning, the number of customers using the Zoom platform increased more than tenfold in like a month. I mean, it was an amazing transformation, and the technology, fortunately, was scalable, and it was able to maintain and adopt the load. But because of that rapid growth, the company has also been growing its cybersecurity and privacy procedures and technologies that are available, end-to-end encryption, true end-to-end encryption, for example, and it continues to work on that and to improve it.
I wanted to touch upon education because this is going to be a workforce issue. Cyber is going to be with us for a long, long time. You've been involved in education your whole career. What do you think needs to be done on a workforce commitment? Because we're going to need experts, because a lot of other countries, as you know, have their own experts, and they don't have the best intentions.
So I read a recent report that the government needs some 400,000 cyber competent employees to really fill its cyber needs. So one of the things that we're working on at UC Berkeley, where I'm now a professor, is to really strengthen the workforce pipeline, to really educate the next and diverse workforce who have competencies in cyber technology, but also in the world of policy making and the like. And I think other universities need to embark on similar efforts, really dedicated to supplying the country with what it needs, which is a truly cyber educated workforce.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Madam Secretary. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
And now it's time to hear from our first panel. I'm pleased to welcome Jennifer Granick, Surveillance and Cybersecurity Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. She favors expanding the right to privacy and increasing the control that individuals have over their personal information. And Meredith Graffanti, Managing Director at FTI Consulting. She co-leads the firm's cybersecurity, data privacy, communications, and provides crisis counseling to companies experiencing cyber attacks and privacy investigations. Thank you so much for being here today. And I wanted to begin this conversation by asking you both kind of a top-down question about how the last year in major cyber attacks has really changed the approach to both consumer privacy and also to communicating with consumers when that privacy is compromised due to these breaches. And, you know, for either of you to take.
I'm happy to start, Maggie. Thank you so much for that question. It's a really good one. You know, post-Colonial Pipeline, post-JBS, Kaseya, I think that ransomware in particular has become more of a common subject to be covered in the media. I think the awareness amongst not only clients, but consumers, regulators of how these attacks happen and the impact that it can have on consumers' day-to-day lives is so important. And then you add in, obviously, the new guidance from OFAC and the Department of Treasury. And there's really been an encouragement, amongst the private sector to work with the federal government, work with law enforcement, to be more transparent in their communications about being a victim of ransomware attacks, to do things like proactively share threat intelligence with law enforcement, particularly indicators of compromise and other helpful threat intelligence to, as Madam Secretary said, work on attribution of these threat actors. So that kind of shift in getting out ahead of the messaging, talking to consumers or clients if you're the victimized organization quickly and making sure that they're the ones that break the news and really control the message has become, I think, quite important. And then I think, having seen Colonial and JBS, I think that really put into perspective the physical disruption and operational disruption that cyber incidents can have in day-to-day lives of our American public. So it's been a wild year, to say the least.
I mean, I would say from the perspective of the public, I think people have a renewed understanding of the importance of information security and protecting their personal data from outsiders. I think you see that in, sort of an uptick in use of secured communications. Whether people are concerned with security and they use WhatsApp, or there's news that suggests that WhatsApp isn't as secure as people think, and then they move to a different application such as Signal. I think there's more concern on on, the part of legislators and states all around the country in passing consumer privacy legislation in order to try to protect this sort of information. And really, I think, a proper focus on a proactive, security-focused effort to protect people's information from unauthorized compromise.
Absolutely. And, Meredith, I wanted to ask you specifically, you served as the lead of crisis communications at Equifax in 2017 following the data breach. Can you speak to how some of this crisis communications work has changed in the years since then, as some of these attacks have only multiplied, and some of the lessons learned in the years since that massive data breach?
Sure, absolutely. I would say that, the shift has really been on the types of attacks. Obviously, Equifax was an APT, and what we're dealing with today are more financially motivated criminal groups. And the attackers have grown much more aggressive in that, now when we're dealing with these ransomware groups, we have to contemplate timely communications, consistent communications with stakeholders, but also getting to them before the threat actors get to them. Meaning, we've seen different threat actor groups take out Facebook ads to publicize their attacks. I've worked for hospital systems where they will contact patients directly and threaten to release their sensitive medical information on the dark web. And this happens all the time as well. The threat actors will reach out to employees of the victimized organization and let them know what's going on. So really I think, the biggest lesson learned over the past few years is, again, just as Jennifer said, being prepared, having a plan down on paper that sort of marries up incident response plans, disaster recovery plans with crisis communications plans that are contemplating these types of aggressive behaviors we're seeing from the threat actors, from what we like to call their own public relations departments. You really want to put the victimized company in control of that message and have them be the ones telling consumers or patients, customers, and regulators what happened, what you're doing to fix it, who you brought on to remediate, contain the situation, remediate, and recover quickly, what kind of workarounds you've put in place to mitigate any operational disruption, and how you're collaborating with law enforcement. I think, building into those preparedness plans, outreach about what happens if your corporate email is offline. How are you going to get a note out to all employees, or how do you plan to contact your clients if you can't reach them via traditional communications channels? Those are the types of things, given these threat actors' behaviors, that we're putting into communications plans and really advising our clients to think about in advance. That, and I would say also building those relationships with regulators and with law enforcement ahead of time prior to an attack is really important, because that minimizes the risk of investigations and fines down the road. So we're encouraging our clients to really be proactive in that relationship building, so that you're not trying to also build those relationships in the middle of a crisis while you're trying to stop the bleeding.
And for Jennifer, a lot of these, not all, but many of these cyber attacks take place due to a lack of cyber hygiene by some of these companies. Sometimes these cyber criminals get in through, maybe less sophisticated means. Do you think, there should be more of a conversation about punishing some of these companies that have these data breaches due to this lack of cyber hygiene? What are your thoughts on how to handle these companies?
Well, I think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. There's what it really incentivizes companies to do better. And I think that, certainly you could think about, having some kind of fine. But by that time, in a lot of ways, the cat is out of the barn. And what you're really looking for is to try to make it worthwhile for entities to really protect the information from the get-go. And I think that means strong encryption. That means multi-factor authentication. That means data hygiene in terms of not keeping sensitive information around for longer than it's necessary. In a number of these breaches, we see that data has been that's not needed is just sitting around because it's cheap to store it. So you need to have data retention laws or data retention practices that get rid of this information, so you don't have like a kind of a honeypot or a treasure trove, for entities to, or for bad actors to attack. And I think that I think the prevention is more important than trying to sort of punish your way into incentives. One of the biggest incentives that we've seen that's been helpful is the breach notification rules. And the breach notification rules now, I think every state or almost every state has one, is sort of a public embarrassment to companies. When certain data of their customers is taken, they have to let people know. It helps the consumer to protect themselves from identity theft and that sort of thing. But it also is a public mark that this company has fallen short in taking care of our information. And I think that kind of transparency is really useful as well.
Well, Jennifer, you actually just teed us up to my next question, which was, I actually discussed this with Congresswoman Clark. There is quite a big effort in Congress right now to push through a federal mandatory cyber incident reporting standard. What are both of your thoughts on this particular issue, and what is industry really looking for in terms of what timelines for reporting, whether they should report if they've paid ransomware? And Meredith, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think the concept of a federal breach notification standard is one that we've been talking about for a long time, and a good one. I will tell you, on the communication side of the house, we're involved in the notification process, and, having to navigate through when you're working with legal counsel on these things, 50 different statutes and standards when you're trying to get these notifications out the door. Some require, a media posting online. Some require a notification via U.S. direct mail. And then you take into account the fact that a lot of times we're supporting multinational companies that are taking into account privacy laws in other countries. It does make it quite difficult. In terms of voluntary reporting, to the federal government, I think you're seeing more and more of that, just because, as we talked about, the threat intelligence oftentimes that you can get from law enforcement and from the authorities about these different threat actor groups, whether that's particular IOCs or threat intelligence on whether or not their decryptor tool is effective, if it's, slow to work. All of those things are so helpful. I also think you're seeing, a lot of companies that have gone through this do a great job of kind of sharing lessons learned after the fact for the good of the whole industry, and really to lift the entire security community up. I know that we just saw the SolarWinds CEO and the Colonial Pipeline CEO participate in one of Mandiant's conferences. And I think those kind of peer-to-peer, especially amongst industry and in particular in the critical infrastructure industry, those lessons learned and those sharing types of forums where, as Jennifer said, the companies aren't really held up as the poster child for something that went wrong, but rather are looked to as sources of information for having gone through this and having come out on the other side of it and learned a lot. So the more that we can continue to encourage that, I think the better off we all are.
I would say one of the things we see at the federal level is often an effort to kind of make less, neutralize the state laws that are being passed. And, California, for example, has a very strong data breach notification law. The proposals that we've seen for federal laws have been weaker. A similar thing with consumer privacy protection. California and New York have passed some strong consumer privacy protection legislation. The consumer privacy legislation that we're seeing proposed in Congress often isn't as strong or as protective as we're seeing. I do think there's an argument there for having a floor below which, a standard of care below which companies cannot fall, but allowing there to be some innovation in the states and some greater protections in the states as well. I think this privacy protection is really important. Our privacy laws are weak, and privacy laws are often put forward as an obstacle to cybersecurity. That's not true. A lot of information is out there. A lot of information is being shared. Some of it should not be shared. Some of it we can continue to share. But the point is that we need to push on both security and privacy if we're going to protect people's information and build that trust that we need to have so that there is that collaboration that everybody here has been talking about is so necessary in order to address these online threats.
And in the short term, to both of you, we do see these escalating attacks, but can you go through some of the specific steps that both companies and individuals, your every man on the street can do right now to try to protect themselves from falling victim to some of these destructive attacks?
I'm happy to start. So especially from a communications perspective, Jennifer, I'll take the companies, perhaps you can take the consumers. As I said before, really getting tight on those incident response plans, ensuring that they're coordinated and complementary to disaster recovery and crisis communications plans. And oftentimes what we see when we work with companies on the preparedness front are these, 100-page beautiful playbooks that get stuck on the shelf and never really used or practiced on. I think what we try to do is encourage companies to practice mobilizing as a team, get really tight on decision making, how certain decisions, paying a ransom, not paying a ransom, are escalated within the organization, thinking through those out-of-band communications channels that I mentioned. What do you do? How do you communicate if your corporate website is down, if your email is offline? So kind of planning for the worst there and practicing those scenarios. And really it's drilling on them. I think tabletop exercises are a term that is very well known in our industry and sometimes overused, but I cannot stress how important they are, because every time you do them, you uncover some sort of gap or some sort of weakness that can be strengthened and kind of enhanced prior to being in the middle of a crisis. So that is my best advice right now for organizations from a comms readiness standpoint.
And Jennifer, any last very quick thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's just a few things that are super important. Use secure passwords, which usually means using a password manager. Turn on multi-factor authentication, something you have, something you know. Update your software, super important. It's a reason why the government should never do anything to make people mistrust software updates. And I think shop for secure services. Make security and encryption a factor in what you purchase and what you use.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today and for appearing here on the Hill's Cybersecurity Summit. And happy National Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie.
And now I'm going to throw to Bob to kick off our next panel.
Thanks, Maggie. With cyber attacks on the rise, companies have had to develop a cybersecurity culture and create initiatives to protect their organizations. And the Chief Information Security Officer usually takes ownership of these initiatives. Joining us now are Anne-Marie Zettel-Moyer, Divisional Security Officer and VP of Security Engineering at MasterCard, and Timothy Rohrbaugh, Chief Information Security Officer at JetBlue. Welcome to you both. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Anne-Marie, let's start with you. You work at the nexus of business and security. What is the most challenging aspect of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Oh, what a great question. Here at MasterCard, we have security as our #1 engineering principle, so it's embedded in everything we do. But even then, there's a time-old challenge of making sure that security is here to enable the business, that we're not, sacrificing speed and innovation for security and vice versa, that it's done in partnership. And so, there is an ongoing challenge to make sure that we are doing things best practice, that we are doing things in a way that's seamless, that makes sense for the customer and the consumer, so that we can keep pace with innovation. And so we invest a lot in security for that and embed our security teams right into our engineering processes. That coupled with making sure that hygiene is up to par all the time are two of the biggest things that I think are important, aside from the people factors, of course.
Tim, I want to ask you about the cyber threats to your industry. Can you just kind of explain it so that we understand the severity of it?
Yeah, I mean, from the industry's perspective, we obviously share a lot of, threat intel between us. We have, information sharing groups like Aviation ISAC. And so the threat groups that we're actually trying to address are the ones that are actually known, could be an ATP, whatever. And they have very specific tactics and techniques that they're specifically trying to achieve with respect to gaining access to either passenger data, it could be misused loyalty information, whatever it may be. And that's the normal ones. And then we have to obviously define some personas associated with those for individual threat actors, and also identify some of the things that we are most talking about today, ransomware and all of that, which is the byproduct of a crime of opportunity, just mistakes made by crew members or employees.
Maggie, let me throw it to you for a couple opening questions.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you both for joining us. We very much appreciate having you here. And I wanted to start with you, Anne-Marie, in that there has been a huge move towards contactless payment during the pandemic for obvious reasons. Can you speak to some of the new security concerns that have come up with so many people migrating into contactless methods?
Well, absolutely. So when you're going into contactless methods, authentication and identity verification are going to be two of the most important things to ensure that the transactions that are being initiated are legitimate, right? And so we've invested in a lot of technologies, anti-fraud technologies, to verify that, who's using the account, not just the device, but the account is who is intended, and how to quickly remedy that. So there's a lot of investment in intelligence and making sure that identities are known and hardened, and that you can verify that who's starting the payment is in fact who's meant to start the payment and who's meant to be accountable for that payment.
And for Tim, you may have seen, I'm sure you did, that last week DHS Secretary Mayorkas announced that there would maybe be some upcoming directives coming for the aviation sector, sort of as part of the response post-Colonial pipeline attack of trying to secure lots of different sectors. Can you speak to your thoughts on these potential upcoming directives and what you think the aviation sector most needs from the federal government right now?
Yeah, I mean, from the standpoint of what I know about the recommendations, some of it's going to be around information sharing, specifically breaches. And we do have a fantastic information sharing program across the airline space. I think best practices which come out of the events, things that we would obviously hope that all of us would make changes to our environment to make it more resilient against these attacks are critically important. But for us, and for many of us, the problem is that we really need to be focused in on what the threat actors want, what the motivations are. And those change dramatically, and sometimes government actions can even modify those. So it's really having two-way communication, especially in things that the government may know based on their actions or based on the intel that they have, and communicating that to us in a timely fashion.
I'm going to go, we have a couple reader questions. And Tim, you have a military background, so I'm going to ask you this question. This is from Pierre LeBlanc, the president of Arctic Security Consultants. And he asks, why is the government not taking action against foreign actors who do not play by the rules?
Yeah, I mean, they are taking action against some foreign actors, but we're talking about nation states or individuals. It's just very difficult. Attribution, as named, I guess, in some earlier discussions, is critically important. Obviously, you can have attribution go to the individual, or you can be misled, and that can have repercussions. So, what actions that they're taking, whether they're enough, that's to be debated. But I think attribution to who it is that's actually doing it is critically important.
Another question, Anne-Marie, for you. Larry Holman, who's retired, has a very interesting question. How can all critical infrastructure be hardened to protect it from all threats, human and natural? Are funds available for that in the Build Back Better legislation that is now, of course, pending on Capitol Hill?
Well, I think we have to be careful with all, right?
Yeah.
Right. You can't clearly, as Tim and I both looked at each other when we heard that, clearly you're not going to anticipate all, and you're never going to get to a point of zero risk. And so you have to be thoughtful about the investments and making sure that we understand the intelligence around what the greatest threats are, and we meet them with the budgets and the resources that we have. Everything is going to be a trade-off. So do I think the funds are available? Do I think that the talent is available, depending on the threat level and what you're trying to guard against? I think there's always methods and ways for improvement, and I think there's always opportunity for extra investment. But I do believe that there are resources available to harden better, to harden now, right? And I think part of that means focusing on hygiene, focusing on fundamentals, making sure that your people are viewed, treated, and supported as your first lines of defense and not liabilities. So I do believe that there are ways to do things a little bit better and make better decisions and better investments. Yes, there are ways to harden better.
Maggie, toss it over to you.
Absolutely. And both of you are in, very different sectors, but at the same time have faced new threats from the pandemic. Can you detail some of the more cybersecurity related threats that the COVID-19 pandemic introduced to both of your industries?
Yeah, I'll jump into one pretty quickly, and that is, we invested so much to protect the employees when they're actually at work, when they're transacting with their desktops, and all of a sudden we were just forced to be to basically have them remote and somehow have some of that same amount of controls and monitoring and things that protect them at home. And then the fact is that when people are at home, they tend to use their personal and work personas more fluidly. And so then that potentially ends up exposing them. So it's been a change in technology, infrastructure, and some of the monitoring tools that we've had to modify based on this.
I think one of the other things that has been quite problematic throughout the pandemic is the amount and the sophistication of phishing attacks, right? Of social engineering attacks using COVID and COVID notifications as a way to allure people into clicking. As Tim mentioned, there is more of a blend between work and home and personas, and you're starting to blend even devices. So if you don't have the right controls and you don't have the right type of training and awareness to help your folks guard against that, you're going to see a commingling of risks there. And we have seen an uptick in threat actors specifically preying upon the emotional side of COVID in order to victimize their targets.
And in this post-COVID world, or this continuing COVID world, what's the biggest threat that you're both focused on moving forward?
The biggest threat, I think, is really just us security folks keeping what we do in a silo and not engaging employees. I mean, if I could strike any one thing from the conversation or that's taught even in academia, is that employees are not the weakest link. Really, it's our issue with respect to us educating them and getting them up to speed in an environment where they are already experts at risk. They're just not experts in cyber risk.
Right. And I would echo that, is that they're our greatest strength. I mean, it's a proud day, and this happens to me several times a week, actually. It's a proud day when I have one of our partners in the workforce reach out to me specifically and say, hey, this looks strange, or hey, this looks weird, can you take a look? And they have no problem calling me up personally. And I love that. And that's how you can make sure that you have thousands of people at the front of your defense, right? Versus this view.
Just a few.
Right. Yes. It's everybody's responsibility. And people are hungry to step up to the challenge, and they're excited to be a part of that too. That's what I found.
Yeah, and let me add one more quick thing, and that is that, as we talk about automation, the speed with which attacks are happening, that's one that we need to, especially post-COVID and into the future, we need to be able to respond in and it's partially a technology problem and partially a data problem.
I want to end on a positive note, and you mentioned some positive things there, but cyber's so scary. If you can briefly, Anne-Marie, start with you, something you've seen that's a positive trend with cyber. It can be at the local level, federal level, it can be at the corporate level, but what have you seen that's gotten better?
Well, I think the awareness is getting better. When things are in the news, there's a camp that, will market that as FUD or say it's FUD. And I see it as a way to start the conversation about something I'm passionate about that I know others will lock arms with me to be passionate about too. And I've seen that more and more, not just even within my company, but within my community. And that tells me that, we're on the brink of some change happening because more people are getting excited about it, are getting invested in it, are feeling the personal effects of it. And they want to be part of the solution. I think that's an amazing benefit.
Tim, what about you?
I'll have to say it's almost something that other people complain about, but I actually think one of the things I'm most inspired with is the information sharing. I mean, we now have actually a complete defensive team across the board, partners and threat intel providers, and then our own industry groups. We're really starting to work together to actually address what is, common threats.
Those were both very good answers. Well, to both of you, thank you for being on our last panel discussion of the day.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, and that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to Looking Glass Cyber Solutions for its support, and to all of you attendees for joining us for this important discussion. And a special thank you to Maggie Miller, the Hill cybersecurity reporter, for joining me in studio. For those who missed any of these conversations, we will have a video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Bob Cusack. Thanks, and have a great day.